Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk and welcome back to the 25th Slimekeep Devlog. In this devlog, I massively improved the Slimekeep boss fight. Also, if you're new here, Slimekeep is a fast-paced roguelike where you must kill and capture slimes to stop the corruption that's infected your land. But without further ado, let's get into it. First, let's start off with addressing some feedback. And oh boy, you guys really came through with lots of feedback on the last devlog. I must admit, it was hard to get through some of this feedback because after spending so much time working on something, it can be hard to accept the obvious flaws. However, I know it's for the better, so I bit the bullet and tried to absorb as many of your guys' ideas into one massive to-do list. Seriously, thank you for all the support in the last devlog and all the great feedback I got on the Slime King boss fight. And for some reason, if you haven't watched that devlog, you should probably do that before watching this one. But anyways, I'll get onto this to-do list of mostly minor tweaks and fixes soon, but first, I had a few things I wanted to work on myself. And one of these additions actually directly relates to one of the most prevalent criticisms of the boss fight in the last video, and that criticism is that the boss fight looks too easy. Now, I can totally see why many of you think this, but what if I told you making these attacks somewhat easy was actually intentional? Many of you suggested that I should have 2 attacks trigger at once to increase difficulty, but I won't be doing that for a multitude of reasons. Instead, I had the plan to add these things that I call ramp-up attacks, to add more difficulty to the fight over time. Pretty much, ramp-up attacks are randomized mini attacks that would trigger after beating each phase of the king. For example, after beating the first phase of the king, a ramp-up attack would be added onto the fight, such as rubble falling from the ceiling occasionally. I like this idea because it would ensure a gradual rise in difficulty over time, and it would allow for some unique mini attacks. In hindsight, I think I probably should have mentioned this plan in the last devlog, but it just didn't occur to me at the time. Enough said, let's get started with creating some of these ramp-up attacks. First up, I started working on a basic system to allow for ramp-up attacks to be triggered. Thankfully, this was pretty easy to implement because I pretty much already had all the necessary logic made for the regular attacks. So I just copied that and made some changes and we were good to go. I then just started outlining my first idea, which would be a simple rubble fall attack, where every now and then some rubble would fall down from the ceiling, potentially hurting the player on impact. So sooner than later, I had this initial concept in game. As you can see, a brief warning would flash and then this rubble would fall down. I shared this into my Discord server and got the living daylights roasted out of me. So I made some changes. First, I added another piece of rubble and changed the warning indicator to be a shadow. I also made many pieces of rubble fall down sequentially and then have a long pause instead of consistent frequent fall. And finally, I added some particles on impact. This was a major improvement, but there was still one major issue. These pieces of rubble didn't look the best. So thankfully, Northern Knight in my Discord server created these amazing replacements. After adding these new pieces into the game, I think this ramp-up attack looked so much better, so huge shout out to Northern Knight for letting me use his work. And you'll also notice I massively sped up the speed of these rebel pieces and added this crack animation, which I think together helps sell the impact of this attack. Overall, I really like this ramp-up and how it's polished. But now let's move on to the next ramp-up. In this ramp-up, it would be an attack where the carpet would flash on fire periodically, potentially damaging the player. Yet again, I got to work starting on the logic for this attack. This wasn't too difficult to actually code up, and I created this sort of explosion animation for the carpet. Altogether, I ended up with this, and yeah, I just didn't think it looked that good. So I scrapped the fire concept and made these spikes instead. I also added a warning flash to the carpet, and I'm just really happy with how this turned out. I think it almost looks mesmerizing. And speaking of mesmerizing, I would be mesmerized if you wishlisted Slimekeep on Steam. Seriously, it helps out a ton with the Steam algorithm, and it only takes a few seconds to do so please consider doing that, link in the description. But moving on, I then created this rough draft for a spear ramp-up, where the guards would throw their spears, which briefly moved towards the player. I got a lot of feedback that the guards should have more of a role in the fight, so I just wanted to have them be at least part of one ramp-up attack. I know these spears don't look the best right now, especially because they are just too accurate, but don't worry, I'll get back to fixing that later in the video. Finally, for the last ramp up, I thought it would be neat to have a bunch of little slimes come out and jump into the Slime King, giving him a small heal. So I hopped into Sprite and created this little medic slime as well as an idle and jump animation. Then I just spent some time setting this up in Unity, and eventually we had this. The slimes would just appear on either the left or right and make their way to the king before jumping into the king, slightly healing him. The player could also actually shoot these medic slimes, stopping them from healing the king. So this imposes a bit of a decision for the player if they want to focus on killing these medic slimes or not. Also, I know this looks like a ton of healing if you just look at the king's health bar, but don't worry, it'll be pretty minor in game. But with that said, those are all the ramp ups I made. So now let's move on to working on a whole bunch of attack, tweaks, and fixes. I first decided to tackle the brute ground pound attack. Admittedly, this attack was pretty clunky and it just didn't look that natural. So I wanted to try to make this jump look more realistic. And that's exactly what I did. Well, not really. I kinda failed making a smooth parabole movement system on my own. But yet again, in times of distress, my Discord server came in clutch with him providing me his own parabole movement system to use. Man, it really sounds like my Discord server is carrying the development of this game, which I wouldn't necessarily say is incorrect. But regardless, I implemented this new movement system, and instantly this ground pound attack looks so much more smooth and natural with a neat arc jump. I also added this little ground pound indicator to give the player some direction. Additionally, I tried my best to make the king's windup and impact have a little more squish by adding in another sprite. However, we're not done just yet. I modified the damage ring to be a little more squash in order to hopefully match the top-down perspective of the game a little more. And I also added in a little ground crack. Finally, I also got quite a bit of feedback from many of you that you didn't like the old flash transition when the attack was done. So I decided to fix this and use the same parabola jump system mentioned before to have the king jump super high and land back on his throne. And honestly, this looks miles better than the previous version. So that's the new ground pound attack for you. But now let's look at the laser attack. This was another attack that I think just needed a little more polish, as right now it looks pretty static. So to fix this, I added in a little laser wiggle effect, which I think adds a lot of life to the attack. I also got some feedback that I should add catcher portals for the laser so it didn't look like they ended nowhere, so I did this and here's what it looked like. I think it's a slight improvement at best. However, that's all I planned for the laser attack. Moving on to the bomb gun attack, I first wanted the king to have a little more input into this attack, so I decided to make this little king up and down animation. Then I set it up so when this attack is triggered, the king will play this animation as well as slam his fist down to start the firing. I also made the bomb gun shoot in waves opposed to a constant rate of fire, playing this animation each time, and added in a short flash before the bombs would explode. Finally, I changed the ease curve for these bombs to make them look a little more natural. There we go, massive improvements all around. Next up is the scythe attack, which just needed a few minor changes. Those changes being, I sped up the speed of the scythe swing slightly. Man, that is a tongue twister. And added this neat little trail renderer. Now for the guard's spear dash attack. I removed their collider and changed it to a trigger as this was previously causing them to glitch out a ton. It can still look a bit wonky even with this change, but I still think it's an improvement nonetheless. I also changed the movement around so that now 100% of the time they were double dash opposed to just 20% of the time. I then gave them the ability to occasionally throw their spears instead of dashing, like the ramp up attack. I think this really helped with adding some variety, but at the same time I think the spear throw looked pretty clunky and just too accurate. So with a lot of ongoing feedback from my Discord, I messed around with the accuracy and delay values for the spear throw. After quite a few revisions, I ended up with this. I really like how now the spears move towards the player, but also are a bit slow to rotate. On to the next attack, we had the king lunge or slide attack. I got loads of feedback saying this attack needed some more impact. But speaking of feedback, Helpful is a great way for you to get feedback on all your different projects, websites, designs, and even games. All I had to do was choose my test type, which was a custom survey in this case, and provide my test data. This being various screenshots and questions I had about the Slime King boss fight. It's also really helpful how Helpful gives you all kinds of great question making tools for gathering feedback. If you want to compare images, videos, they have that all covered, and even things like multiple choice questions and rating scales. And finally, I selected my desired audience, which in this case were people who were familiar with video games. And boom, I can now get quality test results from real people within as little as 15 minutes. The whole process was super easy and intuitive to go through, and I highly recommend it if you need professional feedback on anything. So click the link in the description to give Helpful a try, which I hope will be a pretty helpful addition to your life. Thanks to Helpful for sponsoring this video. But back to impact, ask for it and you shall receive. I first added in a trail when the king lunges and a little jiggle when the king hits a wall. I also wanted to fix this bug where the player could just hide in the corner and avoid getting hit by the king altogether. Initially, I tried adding these diagonal walls to the corners, but this just didn't really work. So instead, I added these spikes that would pop up in the corners, which should hopefully deter the player from hiding there, or they'll just die. And finally, I removed the jarring screen flash when this attack was done and replaced it with the jump from the ground pound attack. Next up, let's talk about the Shuriken Attack. This attack was by far the most hated attack added, and frankly, I have to agree with you guys. I don't think this attack is the best, and I thought it would have been passable, but I guess I was probably wrong. So I set out on a mission to fix this attack. I was initially just going to make some tweaks to this attack, but a quick chat on my Discord server had this really cool idea for an attack where the king would throw boomerangs towards the player, and those boomerangs would lay bombs as they travel, as a replacement. I liked this idea, so as usual, I got to work. I basically just made these boomerangs appear and move towards the player's location and drop bombs along the way. I also made a simple boomerang sprite and made it constantly spin around when thrown. Altogether, here is the new attack, and honestly, I'm pretty happy with it, and I think it fits the assassin phase pretty well. Overall, I think it's a massive upgrade compared to the janky Shuriken attack, but feel free to let me know what you think. Finally, let's look at the last stand attack. This attack definitely needed some touch-ups, so I was here to do that. First, I replaced the out-of-place wall that guards the king from taking damage with the spears from the guards to protect the king. I think this just made the damage blocking look so much better and gave the guards another use in the fight because despite being loyal guards to the king, these guards didn't seem to want to actually guard the king. But that's not all. I also made the fist slam down at slightly different times and added cracks and a slight jiggle for when the fist hit the ground. And with that said, that was pretty much all the attacks I revamped right there. but I still wasn't completely done with the boss fight just yet. I wanted to make sure to add some more elements to the boss fight room to make it feel a bit more alive. So first up, I just added these little flames that would shoot up at the start of every attack. It's just a very minor detail, but I'm sure to help a bit. Another minor detail I added was this fog surrounding the edges of the room. I know it's subtle, but I think it helps a bit with the atmosphere. And there's one more major atmosphere change that I made, but before I talk about that, I worked on reworking the death state for the king. Previously, the player would just kill the king, and there's this pretty clunky looking death animation, but I wanted to rework this. Not only the death animation, but also how the player would end the boss fight. So I started off by making this brief cutscene before the king officially dies. I just made these new Slime King animations where he starts to crack and slowly bobs up and down. Then I created this short little cutscene where I freeze the player and the king begs the player to spare him with the capture gun instead of shooting him. I wasn't even originally going to have an option for this, but I thought it could be a really neat gameplay and story opportunity. Plus, the player can capture or kill basically every slime in the game so far, so I don't see why the final boss should be excluded. Anyways, once this mini cutscene is over, the player gets free reign over his actions. I took great inspiration from Mark Brown's video on invisible choices in games, which are basically choices presented to the player in a subtle way, having the player have to manually make the choice themselves by reforming an action using pre-existing game systems. For example, I wanted the player to physically capture the king and hold down the mouse button instead of just presenting a simple button prompt. This really makes the player feel the impact of their actions and can allow for completely unique and creative interactions. Like, what happens if you disobey the king and decide to shoot him instead of capturing him like he asked, or do something completely different besides shooting or capturing? I just really like this concept and the player freedom it allows for, which is a core concept of Slimekeep. But anyways, in script I set up a few possibilities for some potential interactions, let's just say. I haven't actually implemented what will happen when these interactions are triggered, but I should have a bit of a better idea once I get a better grasp on the game's story and game loop. So that's what I have for the ending or potentially endings of the game. But now let's get back to finishing up the Slime King boss room. I fixed the entrance corridor to the fight to fit the king's tile set, and I also fixed up these corners near the entrance as they weren't rounded and were really bugging me. Next, I made these spears that would appear once the player enters the room, blocking them from leaving. But now let's talk about these stands or bleachers on the sides of the fight. I wanted a ton of little slimes to fill these stands cheering for the Slime King. I definitely could have made all these slimes myself, but I thought it'd be much cooler to have members of the community make slimes for the bleachers themselves. This way, I could actually give people the opportunity to have their slime in the game, and hey, less work for me. So I made an announcement on my Discord server, waited a few days, and started to compile and implement my favorite submissions. This was quite a growing process to say the least, as I had to resize, export, and set up all the art in the game. But I got it done, and here was the final result. I love how these slimes look, and they just make the fight seem so much more alive. Huge thank you to everyone who submitted a slime. I couldn't have done it without you. And if you want to potentially help out with Slimekeep, check out the Discord server, who knows what's to come. But now, the king's room was pretty much done. However, I still wanted to work on the actual king lair, or keep as they call it, leading up to the fight. So I made this corridor room that would connect leading up to the fight. It's just a long, silent walk, preparing the player for what's to come. And I also added these torches to help with the atmosphere a bit. Then, I was naturally going to work on the room prior to the corridor room, but I realized that I should probably first fix the boat ride to the Slime King's lair before doing this, so I get a bit of a better idea of what the keep will look like. So back to this unfinished boat ride scene that hasn't been touched in months, I was. First up, I needed to fix the boat ride animation as it was a bit outdated due to the changes of the player and slime pet sprites over time. So I just fixed that up. Next, I drafted out this amazing drawing of what I wanted the new boat ride scene to look like. Instead of the boat just traveling down a river, I thought it'd be easier just to have it travel down a big body of water instead. I also wanted to remove a lot of this buffer area, or whatever you might call it, to add a dock instead. So I just spent some time working on these changes. First, I cleared out all the junk surrounding this room and replaced it with empty tiles. I also shortened the buffer area and created this dock tile set that I'm pretty happy with. Altogether, I really like how this is starting to look, but I didn't really feel like finishing up just yet, so I'll get to that in the next devlog. Also, just keep in mind that I'm going to wrap up the Slime King boss fight here. I appreciate all the suggestions, and I know everything could be better and more polished, but I just don't want to spend an eternity on this boss fight. You're still free to leave your suggestions in the comments below, but just know that unless I deem it an extremely necessary addition, I probably won't be adding many more suggestions to the fight. Anyways, that's going to be the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing, and wishlisting Slimekeep on Steam. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.